So have you learned anything yet? I've been taking notes, so lots of notes. If I had my .earth blog, I'd already probably have blogged. I haven't had time to tweet.
Me neither.
That's good when you don't have time to tweet.
Good notes.
That means you're really learning. So this interface, this business of companies and behavior and sustainability is so interesting. The thing about climate change and sustainability issues to me is that they're kind of fractal. Like at the global scale, it's really complicated. Saving a forest, it has to deal with the people around the forest, and then what are their lives like? And you get into that little down the rabbit hole on the global question, and you get to the household. How do we save energy? And I live in a 140-year-old house in the Hudson Valley. We're still relying on oil, heating oil, because there's no natural gas pipeline, let alone a sustainable alternative. And how do I deal with that at the village level or the home level? And then there's the companies, and especially in a world that's global, what has to happen from the outside that can kind of nudge companies toward better behaviors? How do you define better? Profit, fiduciary responsibility of trustees of even a university is mostly to maintain their financial integrity. So those are big questions. The corporate end in 2009, I'll just take it to New Mexico. I was writing about BP, Beyond Petroleum at the time. They're still very much in the petroleum business. But about leaks of methane, which is basically natural gas from these gas fields. And there was a guy, they had, under John Brown, really leading, one of the early acolytes of climate seriousness, even in an oil company, gas and oil company. He had built a culture at BP such that there was a guy who has a French name, I can't remember. His job was to run around the world to all BP's gas facilities and see how you're doing in terms of cutting the leaks. And so we did a page one story in the New York Times on the possibilities companies had for cutting the leaks of natural gas, which if it goes into the atmosphere is a greenhouse gas, 36 times more potent than CO2. And if you keep it in a pipeline, it's money. So it seems like it's a no-brainer to keep it in the pipeline so you can sell it and make money. And this guy, he had this, it was an amazing thing. They had built this sort of an ecosystem in which, at the corporate level, there were best practices. That phrase, best practices, is one of these, was not like a number. It was a culture. And like he cut emissions 50% at this New Mexico field, but he came back, he said, why'd you stop? It's like, and they took it down to 99% reduction in emissions by simple changes in how they did their well operations. And I'm thinking, and I wrote this page one story, blah, blah, blah. So that was 2009. What happened in 2010? The Gulf oil spill. Now, so something about BP's culture didn't translate to that ecosystem. The offshore oil ecosystem had its own issues and its own drivers and its own pressures. And this is under, Brown had left the company by that point, but that's a company that kind of got it. And I kept asking the industry folks, like, if it makes money to keep the gas in the pipe, why would anyone, and it's affordable, actually even profitable, why would anyone not do it? So here we have two really brilliant people who've been dug in on this question from different vantage points of corporate culture and getting an outcome, whether it's sales, having a sales force that can get something done, maximizing the bottom line, or energy, dealing with utilities in a creative new way. And Alex, maybe we'll start with you, and if you could just explain you're not at Opower now, Oracle bought it, which must be a very good thing, and just give a thumbnail sketch of what that business was like and how it relates to this theme, and then I want to ask you a couple things.
Sure. Well, first, thank you guys all for being here and for caring about such a critical topic. We started Opower in 2007 before we knew what behavioral science was, right before Cass published Nudge and before all these books came out, with the simple notion that we thought giving people better information about their energy consumption could yield changed behaviors. And we came upon this because my co-founder and I found ourselves driving around constantly in my, at the time, 10-year-old Honda Civic instead of his comfortable Toyota 4Runner because we wanted to save gasoline. And we realized neither of us had any idea whether the homes we were returning to in the evening were the Prius equivalent or a Humvee equivalent, and wouldn't it be useful for people to know everywhere whether their homes were efficient or inefficient and what they ought to do about it?
Mine was inefficient.
What's that?
Mine is inefficient.
so we didn't need to tell you. But nearly everybody, very few people want to waste energy, and yet next to nobody wakes up in the morning thinking, how can I save energy today? And very few people are we had 2 electrical engineers who were able to answer the question as to what was energy consuming, but earlier today. But if success depends on training everybody to become an electrical engineer, we're going to fail. And so we started this company, and at the time, we had some sense that utilities increasingly actually cared, not for social responsibility reasons, not because it looked good on their annual report, but because they had a bottom line financial interest, because they were governed by regulation. They had a bottom line financial interest, state by state, it varied, in helping their customers save energy and achieving energy efficiency. And so we started a company, 2 of us. By the time we sold it to Oracle a decade later, we had gone public on the New York Stock Exchange, 600 employees, working with 120 utilities around the globe. Today, it's a thriving independent entity within Oracle. And among all the numbers I could cite, the thing that I'm sort of most proud of from a business achievement is that the company has now saved ordinary people, in partnership with utilities, saved ordinary people nearly $3 billion on their electric bills, and employed behavioral science. When Nudge did come out, there was a chapter that talked about us, which was super flattering, and Cass and so many other academics took a real interest in helping us. And without their help and guidance, we would not have had the success that we did. By the end, we were running, and still, the largest behavioral science experiment in the world to tens of millions of homes across the globe, testing out different ways of messaging and communicating with customers. But I want to emphasize what I started with, and we'll have time to talk about this, that the success we had, and we're now the saving roughly 5 terawatt hours of electricity a year. The Hoover Dam produces just shy of 4 terawatt hours a year. So this software company that dams up no water but does send better information to consumers is having a bigger impact than the Hoover Dam. We would not have had success, even with all the help from brilliant academics, were it not for the fact that businesses' interests, corporate interests, had been aligned through regulation and through policy with the public interest. And it was said earlier that all the success that we all can have from choosing to eat less meat, or choosing to carpool or take a hybrid when we do drive, all of those individual actions will amount to very little unless we also have government policy that pushes big actors. And so I think our success is the consequence, not necessarily the inevitable consequence, but the consequence of actions that were taken by far-sighted legislators and policymakers. And it's easy to get discouraged about government in this country and many others these days. But it's essential that among the behaviors we all adopt is a behavior to hold our governments accountable for enabling the solution to this global problem.
That's great. Just a quick question: is there anything in the last 2 years of politics that has been sustained that maintains that shape to the regulations and laws?
Yeah.
We've had a lot of
There's a lot
rollbacks,
but most of these regulations happen at the state level in the U.S. And so in many cases, these regulations have been strengthened, perhaps in response to abdication at the federal level. Perhaps it's coincidental. There are some places where they've been walked back. Toby's here from the UK government, a government that's also perhaps not exemplary in its functioning these days. But with regard to climate policy, it's maintained and actually accelerated its leadership position. So I think there's plenty of good to be said about what's happened at state and local levels, and of course there's a lot inspiring from increased activists and movement, Sunshine Movement, and young people who are rising up to demand action from their governments. So it's incumbent on all of us to help them out.
Just to broaden this a tiny bit, I did a story recently for NatGeo on the Amazon rainforest under the new president, Bolsonaro, who is very much about developing the Amazon, modernizing. And one of the notions that's come up is that what they call sustainable intensification of agriculture. If you can get more soybeans and beef, less beef ultimately, but more beef from less land, then you can spare the forest. And I interviewed an economist, Bernardo Strasberg, a geographer in Brazil, and quoted him in the story. He said, without law and regulation, sustainable intensification is fine in the short term, but then it leads to more swirl and spread. So those predicates, whether you care about the future of the Amazon rainforest or energy use, seem to be a consistent kind of.
Yeah, I think farming has a particularly challenge because if everything was centrally planned, I think that kind of intensification makes sense. The problem is that land is owned by lots of different landowners, and each landowner wants to maximize their yield. In fact, there's a lot of evidence that they want to maximize their yield in ways that are not economically rational, that they're willing to spend more money on more fertilizer, on more inputs to get where the marginal output is either because of yield or because of the marginal price that they'll get for that output is diminished. And so, I think the good news is there's fruitful opportunity for the intervention of behavioral science in shaping all kinds of behaviors, including the behaviors of farmers.
So we're going to take a step into a sort of a darker arena if your main concern is sustainability, I think, in the sense of the grander marketing and corporate pressure that suffuses everything we talk about when we talk about climate or the like. And Charlotte has worked in marketing, and you're now Chief Behavioral Officer, CBO. There can't be a lot of you, CBOs, at Maritz, right?
Maritz,
but you were at GM
I was at GM previously, yeah, so coming with a lot of background in automotive, but we do work in all industries, but bring a lot of...
What was interesting, we were talking a little bit backstage, her main focus, if I get this right, is the internal ecosystem within a company and its suppliers and its partners, and how do you maximize productivity and profit and the like.
Yeah, kind of all of the above. Maritz does programs in the consumer and internal employee space, but maybe most interesting to this discussion about sort of behavioral science on the front lines would be this third layer, this B2B channel distributor network that is easy to forget from a marketing standpoint. Consumer behavior is really important, consumer tastes, preferences, values, and marketers are generally pretty good at understanding those and thinking like scientists. I heard a lot of great case studies and anecdotes from the advertising industry today, especially, and it's almost becoming like common practice when it comes to understanding consumers. We think like scientists. We run experiments, we run A/B tests, we do a lot of research before we launch something new. But when we stop and turn that light internally or to our distribution channels, are we even measuring things? Do we know that these programs are designed efficiently to motivate people who are selling our products and ultimately dealing on the front lines with consumers? And almost always the answer is not really, or I don't know, or we've done it this way for 100 years. So that's kind of my role as CBO of Maritz, which does a lot of things for everyone. We started with the gold watch for retirement, if anyone's familiar with that sort of iconic idea that came out. Edward Maritz invented that like 100 years ago. So it's cool, yeah. So that kind of gives you a sense of where we play. It's trying to commemorate, to basically acknowledge, reward, incentivize, and otherwise generate discretionary effort and performance out of your stakeholders. So knowing that, I think it's time for a movement of behavioral science when it comes to salespeople. So in the US, we spend 5 to 8 times the amount we spend on advertising. We spend that 5 to 8 times that amount on salesperson compensation. But we do very little scientific research around that. So that's what we're trying to change through experimentation, largely through academic partnerships, as Alex was saying, through experimentation and also just whatever we can to bring best practices in from behavioral science into the modern marketplace.
And how much of this is about scale? A couple of things that have caught my attention in recent years were the guitar company, Taylor Guitars, Bob Taylor, was running short of places in the world where he could find ebony that was not pirated from Madagascar and wrecking forests and the like. And so he found in Cameroon, ebony is the black wood, that wonderful lustrous wood for the guitar fingerboard. And he found a supply in Cameroon that's sustainable. It's harvested in a way that's good. And he has a sawmill. And the challenge is everyone's grown up with a guitar with black fingerboards. And so part of his marketing now is to explain to the ebony from this area is more marbled. It's not perfectly black. So part of his work now is to convince the world's best guitar players that henceforth the best guitars in the world will have not a perfectly black fingerboard, and it's still the best guitar, and that's part of the definition. And I love this story, right? And then I was at a meeting here in Washington on sustainable business, and this chief, he wasn't, some high mucky-muck in sustainability at Nike was on the stage, and I kind of asked him, I raised my hand, and I said, hey, there's this guy who's working with his consumers to redefine quality. And he said something really interesting. He said, well, we've done A/B testing, and when we come out with a sneaker and we have it sustainably produced, it's seen as it marks it down. People don't want that because it implies a compromise. Mm-hmm. That was really interesting. So the scale question is really huge. And the guitars made in China are not thinking about this too. And you mentioned electric vehicles and talk about dealers, like car dealers, and how that changes the whole landscape.
Yeah, I mean, I could talk about dealers all day. I mean,
one thing about EVs was really interesting.
Yeah, about EVs. Well, I think it calls to mind an opportunity to look for conflicts of interest and thinking about who your customer really is. So automotive is especially unusual in that the manufacturer does not control the distribution point with the consumer. So auto dealerships are totally independent businesses. They're not beholden to the manufacturer, and they can kind of do what they want. So they do. So they're pretty heterogeneous in that effect. And the best way to influence their behavior is typically through incentive programs, and that's where Maritz comes in. But incentives only take you so far when there's sort of built-in inherent conflicts of interest. So I hesitate to bring this story to the stage because I don't have an answer for it, but it's something that really we're all coming together, which is so electric vehicles, it's in sort of the planet's best interest, and there's a rising consumer demand for them, but they involve, they include 1/5 the parts. So an electric vehicle has about 20% of the parts that a traditional internal combustion engine vehicle does, which is really, that's where dealerships make the bulk of their revenue. So dealerships have razor-thin margins on new vehicle sales. In fact, the only industry with slimmer margins is grocery wholesaling. Yeah. So it's pretty tough business to just sell new cars, and that's why that's not really where they make their money. It's through servicing vehicles. So if you were a car dealer and you're faced with the prospect of selling more electric vehicles, that might incite a lot of fear in you, and you have to think, well, how am I going to continue to survive? My whole business model has to change. So just calling that out and just shining the light on who your real customers are and having some empathy for how they consider themselves sustainable. So that helps us think, how can we help manufacturers build better partnerships with those dealerships and go forward into a very different future.
And that leads into the macro world again of what do we do? That's also talking about reduced labor force. It's like automation, the same thing. Mm-hmm. And what happens there. So much of that's about economics and policy and behavior. We have a few minutes left, so I'd like you get with that sense, like there's a research agenda there, essentially. It sounds like there's something to work on there. That's a hard problem you identified. So if each of you could just kind of give some kind of manifesto moment here for how, knowing the skills, with the skills that you have, how do we fill in some of these blanks or at least get started toward a more sustainable mobility and energy? What would that look like? Just what do you think?
My signature statement is don't just do it, test it. Lead like a scientist and run an experiment to know whether something really worked. So we've been running some RCTs across dealership networks, for example, where you would randomize, just as a scientist would design an experiment, we would try something new with an incentive or reward and compare that versus a control group to prove what really works. And that means really works to the government, to the marketplace, and to the dealers.
So sort of nudgy test, just ways to build a different relationship with dealers that might incentivize some.
And just to improve your business. Yeah, change things and measure them.
And?
I'm leery of manifestos, but I guess one thing there are a lot of practitioners in the room and people thinking about starting their own businesses or enterprises. And I would just suggest that the denominator matters, which is to say that we chose to work with utilities not because we had a particular love for utilities, but because they serve everybody. And though the nudges we employ reduce consumption by only 2 to 3% in any one house, it's de minimis in one home, across tens of millions of homes, it adds up to a pretty sizable impact. And as you're thinking about interventions to run, I think thinking about not just the numerator, not what is the percentage impact that I can have by getting somebody to adopt this behavior, but also how many people can I get to adopt this behavior, or how many organizations. I think that's a critical and surprisingly overlooked consideration. Yeah.
I'd like
it's
to
a pretty
just
boring manifesto. But.
No.
I'd like to add a note of congratulations to Alex for introducing a new verb to our community. At Maritz, sometimes we use the phrase, we could just Opower them as sort of a shorthand for social comparison as a nudge. So congratulations, you're like,
Boy, that's
you're like the
fabulous.
Kleenex of the applied behavioral science.
One answer on the vehicle sales is to find new channels to sell through. And I know legally it's difficult. The manufacturers can't do that, and I'm following some of the case law on this a little bit. That's what you do when you don't have a job. But it strikes me that we've gotten used to buying products through channels that we didn't even imagine existed a decade or 2 decades ago. And the next time somebody buys a car, they may be able to buy it through somebody else.
Jeff Bezos.
Yeah, well, right. But I think there are opportunities, and I think that sort of one of the big opportunities, of course, is yes, your maintenance costs and fuel costs are diminished with an electric vehicle, but the upfront cost is higher, and so it strikes me that particularly in a world of rising interest rates, and I suspect we'll see that at some point, that there are opportunities for people to finance that upfront cost. Maybe it's non-traditional financial players like Jeff Bezos or the electric companies, or maybe it's banks. But these are places where the car is more often than not, the second most expensive asset that a person owns. Sometimes it's the most expensive, and it's often a bad financial decision. So how do you help shift customer behavior and improve financing? I don't know.
All right. Well, there'll be more opportunities for them to interact with both of you. Thank you very much, Charlotte and Alex, and on into the future toward a balanced planet somehow. That's our National Geographic goal. Thank you.
Hope so. Thank you.
No Q&A? Okay.
Go get 'em.